Mentoring webinar series, and thank you for joining us. Today, we'll be talking about how to support mentors and mentees in the face of challenges and difficult situations. I'm Jennifer Burgoyne, Program Manager at Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, and I'll be introducing today's conversation. Let's get started. This webinar is part of the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series, which is funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention through the National Mentoring Resource Center and facilitated in partnership with Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. These webinars would not be possible without the planning team, which includes the amazing mentoring affiliates shown on this slide. In addition to this webinar series, the National Mentoring Resource Center provides many resources for mentoring practitioners. At the end of this webinar, we'll provide more details about how you can access this free support. Before we get started, I wanted to share some housekeeping information. In about 1 week, you'll receive an email with information about how to download a copy of these slides and view the webinar recording. You can also access this information directly by going to Mentor's website in the next week. And to continually improve this series, we're looking for your input. A short survey will pop up as you exit the webinar. Please take about 3 minutes to give us your feedback. It's really helpful. So we want this to be a participatory experience. So please use the question box to ask questions throughout the webinar. Our friend Cheryl from Mentor, Illinois will be queuing up questions to share with panelists throughout the webinar. We may not get to all questions because there are several hundred of you on the webinar today, but we will certainly do our best. The questions that we share with panelists are generally ones that broaden or deepen the conversation. So first, we want to get a sense of who is on the call with us today. So I'm going to launch a couple polls here. The first one is, what is your experience level in the mentoring field? Beginner, experienced, or expert? I'll give you a moment to answer. All righty, so it looks like we have about 60% are experienced, 30% are beginner, and about 10% are expert. That's great. We're happy to have a good range on the call. And then our second poll here, what is your role in the mentoring field? Are you a practitioner, researcher, technical assistance provider, funder, or other? Give you just a few more seconds here. All right. Wow, it looks like we've got 57% practitioner. We've got about a third who are other. Very interesting. Feel free, if you have a second, to type in your role in the chat box. We'd love to see that. And about 10% are technical assistance providers. That's great. Well, we welcome everyone, and we think and hope that today's information will be applicable to all of you on the line. All right. So first, I wanted to introduce today's facilitator and one of our panelists, Dr. Dustianne North. Dustianne has provided training and technical assistance in the field of youth mentoring and related youth services fields since 1995. She draws upon her diverse experience and training to work with direct practice issues such as communicating with youth, as well as community issues, program design, and interagency partnerships. Dr. North has recently helped to reestablish the California Mentoring Partnership and has convened researchers and advocates to initiate new mentoring research. Welcome, Dustianne.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks. And then we're also thrilled to have two other highly esteemed experts join our panel today, Dr. Torie Weiston and Dr. Jaime Romo. Dustianne is going to introduce you to these panelists and tell their work very soon. So to kick us off, I'm going to pass things over to Dustianne.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want to thank Mentor and our panelists for today, Drs. Torie Weiston and Jaime Romo for making this happen. This is a critical topic for all mentoring programs, so I'm thrilled that we have so much interest in it. Our youth today are just faced with so many challenges, whether they be mental health issues, violence in homes and communities, academic challenges, or what have you. Mentors and staff really need help in addressing these tough concerns and situations. And it's critical that when we do that, that we keep in mind that a high percentage of our youth who are mentored embody marginalized identities, and that many have encountered serious trauma. So it's essential when we think about how to address these crises with youth that we give attention to cultural concerns and also trauma-informed perspectives, especially given the recent rise in identity-based aggressions and attacks on civil rights of many of our youth. So, and based on our surveys of previous webinar participants, we know that you all are very concerned about these issues, especially in today's environment. And so that is why we've invited Torie and Jaime to participate today, precisely because they can bring these cultural lenses and these trauma-informed lenses to the topic. So we're so pleased to have you, Torie and Jaime, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about each of them as we go on here. As an aside, I just wanted to mention that I'm coming to you live today from the Summer Institute on Youth Mentoring at Portland State, which is an exciting place to be. And we're actually addressing very similar and related issues here. So it's great to see some real energy and time dedicated to these very pressing concerns on a national scale. So to get us started, I'd first like to offer a few framing thoughts about addressing difficult issues with youth in kind of a broad sense. And then I'll introduce our panelists and ask them to each briefly share their thoughts on the subject. And then we're going to have the opportunity to delve deeper into our topic using a discussion style approach, where we'll ask some probing questions of the panelists about our topic and their lenses on it. And we'll also be able to entertain some questions from all of you out there. So Jennifer gave you some instructions on how to enter your questions in the chat box, and Cheryl, our question moderator, is going to be looking at those closely and vetting them. So please feel free to go ahead and just start hammering those out whenever you have a thought, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Okay, so here we go. The slide that's on the screen is just a place that I like to start because we know that when we do mentoring, there's just such a high potential for mentors and program staff to kind of run afoul when talking with youth in tough situations. And these are just some of the sort of, for most of us, hopefully kind of obvious roadblocks that might run in the way that we often have to train our mentors out of. Sometimes even very well-intending mentors just don't have the tools and skills to be collaborative. They don't know how to be inspirational, and so instead they engage in some of these not so positive behaviors or communication strategies. So then the question becomes, how do we take a different approach? Jennifer, we could go to the next slide, please. And so a lot of us have training in some of these kinds of basic communication strategies. I'm guessing that these are familiar to many, if not all of you. So active listening strategies, iMessages, paraphrasing, open-ended questions. These are all great strategies for avoiding some of the roadblocks that we just talked about. But I didn't figure that we would spend too much time on these today because there's so many resources available on these, and we figured that most of you have at least something about this already in your mentor training and in your own professional background. So the question is, how do we put these very valuable skills to use and others when we're really dealing with a very delicate topic or tough situation? So that's what today's topic is really more about. So as we delve into that, there are a couple of guiding principles that I like to suggest. And in a short webinar, we can't get into these in too much detail, but I just want to at least put them out there. So the first is the importance of self-determination and empowerment, so that, you know, youth often have the answers within themselves for what they need or want to do for their situation. It's our job to bring that out. And most importantly, we need to respect their right to make their own decision, to make their own mistakes even sometimes. And that the goal is to empower them rather than to necessarily tell them what to do. So that would recommend a much more collaborative approach rather than what we think of as a prescriptive approach. And of course, we know from the research that prescriptive mentoring is not particularly effective. And it's when mentors really collaborate with their youth that they tend to have better results. So what that tends to speak to is collaborative problem solving rather than, in most cases, giving advice per se. Now, there are some situations, if it's a technical thing or if the youth is just really confused and wants to hear what an adult might think of it, they might really press you on that. Sometimes it's okay to give some guarded advice, but always with the caveat that ultimately it's up to them. But in most cases, we want to engage them in a problem-solving process so that they're learning problem-solving skills and learning how to think for themselves rather than telling them what to do. And then just a quick mention that I know that we always have concerns in our programs about confidentiality issues, and also when do we self-disclose? When is it good to talk about ourselves with our mentees or the youth in our programs, and when is it best to keep the focus on them or not necessarily share? And actually here at the Summer Institute, this came up several times, and lots of sentiment that it is important for the young people to know who we are, have a sense of a little bit about our lives. We just don't want to be unloading our own problems on them or burdening them with more of our quote-unquote stuff than they might need. So those are just a couple of guiding principles to think about. Obviously, we could talk for days about each of these, but just wanted to float those out there. All right, and then this is another useful sort of framework that folks have had success thinking about. So a young person comes to you with a difficult issue or with something they want to discuss, and immediately you find yourself asking, wow, what am I running into here? Is this just kind of a general topic that might be difficult to talk about? Maybe the 8-year-old who says, hey, where do babies come from? Or maybe a mentee mentions, gosh, we're of a different racial background than each other, aren't we? And there's no problem, there's no crisis, there's no concern, but these are just sort of delicate topics. So that's the yellow range on this slide. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we have what we might think of as immediate and acute crises. So something is happening immediately, something is critical, something needs to be done. Either someone is in trouble in a safety sort of way, or something has just happened to them that maybe is traumatic. It can also be events like, let's say someone is pregnant. Maybe your 17-year-old mentee is pregnant, and we may all have different opinions and feelings, and the mentee may have different opinions and feelings about whether this is a good crisis or a bad crisis. But nonetheless, it's something that potentially was unexpected and requires immediate intervention. So we would think of that as an immediate or acute crisis. And then in the middle, we have this sort of nebulous and actually kind of difficult range of issues to address, which are what I think of as ongoing issues of concern. And these are issues that may be very close to the red end of the spectrum and very challenging, or could be not so intense, closer to the yellow, but they're deeply entrenched and they're difficult to actually intervene to address. So one example I like is I had a situation where a mentor was matched with a mentee and got wind a couple months into the match that the mentee had gotten in trouble for a fairly serious fist fight at school. And the mentor was very concerned. This is a crisis. We need to intervene. This is violence. And come to discover, as more information came out, that this mentee had been suspended 3 years in a row in previous years for having many, many fist fights. And this particular fist fight was the first one in the entire school year, and it was almost the end of the school year. And so the mentee was actually improving quite a bit on the fist fighting issue and had reined it in, so to speak. And here was the mentor about to think, oh no, something terrible happened. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but in context, this was an entrenched issue. And if the mentor comes flying in saying, oh my goodness, there's been violence, we need to intervene, they're not actually meeting the mentee where they're at, and they're not understanding the deeply entrenched issues going on. So this is just a nice way to think about what kind of issue am I dealing with, and you won't always know when it's first raised which one of these it is. but each one might demand a different response, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So we can move on. And so this is a quick poll I'd like to do just for fun. When we are working with youth and they're talking with us about some of their difficult issues, there's sort of three areas of concern that I think any of us might be thinking about. One is, what is sort of the emotional needs of the mentee or the youth who's coming to me right now? How are they feeling? How do I meet them there, et cetera? The second is their physical and psychological safety. Like, are they okay? Is there some action that needs to be taken to make sure that they're safe? And then the third is, how can we help them address whatever it is they're bringing me? What are some problem-solving ideas? What are some resources? So a question to the crowd out there, and this will be a poll, so you can actually click and give an answer. Where do you think you begin when you go to address an issue with a mentee? And of course, this might depend on the issue a little bit, but go with me on this thought experiment. Where do you think you might begin? Go ahead and enter your answers. And I'll say that there's not necessarily a right answer, so think about why you're choosing the one that you are. Okay, so we have 71% of you think that physical and psychological safety is the answer. 20% of you think that immediate emotional needs is the answer, and 9% think that problem solving and resources are the answer. Okay, all good thinking, and if you'd like to type in some of your reasoning into the chat box about why you chose the answer you did, please feel free and folks will see it. So where I go with this is that the first two, it kind of depends on the situation. So generally speaking, you want to meet emotional needs first. If someone's crying, if they're nervous about having come to you, you want to make sure they feel okay about that before anything else. But of course, if you're standing in the middle of the street while you're trying to have a conversation, or if someone's just, again, to use the example of violence, if there's been violence that just happened and you need to get out of the area before you can address something else, then safety might come first. But the caveat there is that sometimes when a mentee brings an issue that involves safety, the mentor or the staff person can get very concerned about safety and forget to just sort of address the emotional need of, I just made myself vulnerable, I just came to an adult, I'm feeling all kinds of things, and I need that addressed before anything else. The one caution I would give here for the 9% who thought that problem solving and resources is the place to start is that sometimes this can shut down our youth and can make them think that if they come to us and we immediately just start solving their problem and offering resources, that we're not actually feeling them and we're not actually hearing them. And we also might not know enough about the problem to do a good job with the problem solving and resources. So I might suggest you delay this bottom circle here as long as you can and address the first two first. And which of those top two you address will depend on the situation. So that's kind of my take on that. But up for discussion for sure. So give that some thought. Talk with your program staff and other friends about that, okay? And the last point I want to make before we go into our, before we hear from our panelists is that anytime we're addressing difficult issues and trauma and really hard stuff, we have our own personal work to do around those things. These kinds of situations bring up our own emotions, our own healing work. If we're not careful, we can impose or project those issues onto our youth. So we always want to be asking the question, how do we take care of our own emotional needs as these issues arise? And how do we keep that separate from helping the mentee? So I hope some of these thoughts have just kind of framed the issue for us. And now we'd like to dive a little more fully into hearing some of these different lenses or approaches that we could take. So to get started with that, I'd love to introduce Dr. Torie Weiston, who we're thrilled to have with us today. Torie is a scholar and practitioner with over 11 years of teaching and youth programming experience. She does extensive work with community-based organizations in support of their youth advocacy efforts. She specializes in training mentors to work with diverse youth populations, Black, Latinx, LGBTQ, first-generation college students, and low-income youth in particular. And she's the author of the acclaimed new book, Critical Mentoring, A Practical Guide, which I hope everyone picks up a copy of. And as I hand this off to Torie, I thought where we could begin is, Torie, can you tell us, just so people understand, what is critical mentoring and how might it inform our topic today? So take it away, Torie.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be talking about this because, as Dr. North mentioned earlier, our young people are dealing with so much, especially when it comes to the sort of historical context that we are in. And so I just think it's important for us to have conversations as mentors as to how we can continue to equip ourselves with the tools and strategies that we need. So again, thank you for doing this. So critical mentoring is sort of my spin on mentoring. And it starts with the assumption that we basically live in toxicity, that if young people's contexts were water and air, it would be impossible to breathe and impossible to drink. And the critical mentoring process is about really dealing with this issue. As I see it, traditional mentoring systems sort of ignore context. We focus a lot on fixing the young person, and we don't deal with what's happening around them. So critical mentoring is about moving to clear the water and purify the air alongside of our young people. So it's not about using mentoring to manage symptoms, but leveraging mentoring to address root causes, becoming more active, becoming more engaged, listening to our youth more, and dealing with some harsh realities that, quite frankly, we don't always like to address or deal with. So the next slide has a graph that sort of explains how I came to the critical mentoring process. As an educator, I was doing a lot of research in the area of critical race theory and education, and I was in awe of how these concepts are so appropriate for working with young people, and didn't understand why we hadn't necessarily made the explicit connection in the mentoring field. And so I took some very sort of basic elements of critical race theory and thought about how they can inform the work that we do in mentoring.
Great, thanks, Torie. And so now coming back to our topic for today, what would you say from a critical mentoring lens are some strategies and tools that can be used when communicating about difficult issues with mentees?
Torie, can you hear us?
Oh, did we lose her? Torie, maybe you're muted.
Oh, yes, it looks like Torie is muted. Torie, if you can hear us, it says self-muted. You may want to try to unmute your line there. Sorry for this delay, everyone. We're going to try to work to get Torie up and running here.
Yeah. I suppose we could put up her slide for a moment, and if we don't get her soon, we could go on to Jaime and maybe come back to her.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I just messaged her, so hopefully she'll respond in a moment here. Just sit tight.
Great.
I'm not sure if I'm being heard again. I'm sorry.
Oh, there we go, Torie. Yeah, we lost you there for a bit, but we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. And so sorry for the interruption. So what I was saying is that critical race theory really does make a difference using that framework in terms of informing our mentoring relationships, thinking about ideas like the fact that racism is normal, it's very much a part of our everyday interactions, and as a result, our young people's everyday interactions, and thinking about how that influences them and how that has to do, again, Dr. North, back to your slide about their emotional needs, their psychological needs, and their well-being. And then the slide that we're currently on about critical interrogation of context is really more about the work that mentors need to do to be more aware of what kind of society we exist in and what kinds of things our young people are struggling with. And so what I have here are a set of very alarming photographs, all of which are connected to young folks of color experiencing violence on some level. You can see that really unfortunate situation of the police officer who was sitting on the young Black girl who was attending a pool party. And then you can also see, and I'll just point out a couple of these pictures of Trayvon Martin, who's become really an icon in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and really making us more aware of the violence that young people are enduring. And then the one with the police officer pulling the young Black woman out of the school desk, I always like to point people to because that's violence happening inside schools. And I think that's another question we need to have as mentoring practitioners and professionals. So often, our mentoring programs are extensions of schools. And schools are real sites of violence for young people who have marginalized identities. So we have to sort of look around at this context, and we have to utilize this context to help inform how we approach mentoring. And my next.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm.
So what I'm sort of arguing here is that critical mentoring really, at the crux of it, is about being able to have these conversations, to have these difficult conversations. Again, not ignoring what's happening, not dismissing it, or like I know at the Summer Institute, we were talking about the fact that, some people avoid these conversations because they feel uncomfortable or they're not sure, what direction to move in. But I think that is just as harmful. So I think we have to really work on ourselves as mentors, train, read, have dialogue with one another so that we can be more prepared to have these conversations with young people. My other suggestion is that we really allow young people to have more of a voice in the mentoring relationship and to lead the mentoring relationship. And that means, also letting them lead these difficult conversations. Sometimes these conversations happen not because we want them to, as I just said, we, sometimes avoid them, but it's because the young person is ready. And so allowing them that space and that freedom to be able to express themselves and to be able to say what they need or how they feel about these situations is particularly important. Also to create more group or cohort spaces to just maybe let the young people talk amongst themselves with guidance or support from us. We always feel like, especially in the mentoring world, an adult has to be centered. Maybe we don't have to be centered. Maybe we just create the space, establish the platform, and let young people talk. Let them talk to one another, and again, with guidance and support from us. And then finally, we have to be more brave. We have to stop doing what's most comfortable for us and start doing what's most comfortable for our young people.
Excellent thoughts. Thank you so much, Torie. And so a couple of takeaways I got from that right away. One, just this comfort, just having comfort with the difficult topics will help our young people have comfort with it and show that we're brave and strong about it. We'll give space for them to explore it and feel safe with it, and also help them feel brave about it. And then the other theme that Torie just brought up that I want to just highlight, and it's come up a lot at our Summer Institute here as well, is just this very subtle but incredibly powerful shift from the notion that our problems are inside our mentees and that they need to become better, stronger, different, more this or more that. And of course, they are growing and developing youth, and we want to support that development process. but the idea that problems are most often in the environment around them and that we can partner with them to try to solve those problems rather than try to change the mentee. And I think this is, in a general sense, not a new concept for mentoring, in that we've always said we want to partner with our youth to solve problems, but I think we have been very guilty of seeing the problems as mostly residing in the young person, or that the problems are in their community, but it still has to come from internal change for them to address them. And so we can end up encouraging youth to adapt more and more to something that's not actually adaptable to. And instead, we might want to engage them in changing the environment around them. So I just want to really support those thoughts that that Torie is making, and thank you, Torie, for that. And so then let's change gears a little bit here, and let's hear from Dr. Romo. Jaime has served as a K-12 teacher and administrator and teacher educator. He's a minister for healing and healthy environments. He's provided technical assistance for SAMHSA and for the Center for Applied Research Solutions on Trauma-Informed Care, and through our National Mentoring Resource Center as well. And Dr. Romo is a certified traumatic incident reduction facilitator and a hospice chaplain. And Jaime is going to talk with us a little bit about a trauma-informed lens on this question of dealing with difficult issues. And so, Jaime, could you tell us a little bit about how you define trauma and how you feel like it affects the youth that we are serving today?
Sure. Thank you very much. I love this topic, and I would say my own background, I've been an academic and a practitioner, and now I'm really identifying more as a healer, and that does relate to the what both of you, Drs. North and Weiston, have brought up, is that we're not doing to anyone, and the mentoring process is none of that. It's really being a companion and creating this space and holding the space that then the mentees can process and grow. So, that said, we're holding this space because trauma is so pervasive. So SAMHSA says it's an event or a series of events that people experience, and that has implications. Judith Herman has a much, I think, more profound and helpful definition, in that it could be an actual or a perceived threat of danger or loss that overwhelms our coping ability. And so it could be anything. And our bodies respond, the chemicals race through us in response to protect us, to flee or to fight, whether something is real or perceived. And that's where, when we look at some of the interpersonal things that happen that Dr. Weiston was pointing out, those are certainly traumatic and overwhelming. They present a physical threat, an emotional threat, and so on. But even if something is perceived and not physically happening to someone, it has an impact to overwhelm us, and that starts a whole chain of reactions. We can't get into today, but just to say, trauma is pervasive, and Torie used the word toxic. That it does impact us in many ways, and so I'll talk a little bit more about that. I am curious, though, before going on, about how much you know about the ACE survey, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study by Drs. Facilitator and Ed.D. Very significant in understanding what's going on individually, interpersonally, and institutionally. And so if you would take a moment, please, to rate yourself and how familiar you are with this study that has been replicated in many settings, from juvenile justice to education to mental and behavioral health to the judicial system, law enforcement, and so on. It's more of a national movement, not just an isolated, interesting thing. So please tell us, what do you know? And what I mean by competent is that you recognize your own experiences, and then you can go beyond that to use that for others. So a good amount looks like are unfamiliar, and a little bit more than have some familiarity, but maybe not enough to see the implications for ourselves, let alone to see how that could be playing out with someone else. And so thank you, that's real helpful for me. So let me just say a little bit then about, yeah, thank you. If you just stay there for a minute. With ACEs, Pallidi and Deanda, what they found by studying a group of insured middle-aged, white, college-educated, employed people from San Diego who were insured by Kaiser, was that there were different experiences that people had, individual ones that happened to them, they happened, or they didn't happen, like neglect, or they happened around them, or maybe things that they even did that later on had an impact on their physical health. And so the numbers are astounding. I really recommend that you take some time to read some of the studies and the ways that people have used it, or maybe that merits a webinar all in itself. But the numbers are astounding in terms of how they correlate. And I'll just say a couple of things. For example, child with 6 or more categories of adverse childhood experiences are 250% more likely to become an adult smoker. Right? A male child with an ACE score of 6 has a 4,600% increase in the likelihood that he'll become an IV drug user later in life. Regarding depression, individuals with an ACE score of 4 or more, 460% more likely to be suffering from depression. And when it comes then to suicide, childhood and adolescent suicide attempts are increased 51-fold with an ACE of 7 or more. And it's when someone is experiencing neglect, experiencing verbal, psychological, physical, sexual abuse, these ACEs add up quickly. When they're in an environment where there's violence, where there's people behaving in ways that are unreliable or unpredictable, all these things add up. It's not that hard to have 4 or more ACEs. And there's studies throughout school systems that are recognizing that a high percentage of students have 4 or more, and that impacts their cognitive ability. All that's to say that we can be overwhelmed. We can absorb these toxic experiences at individual level in our environment by what happens to us, but what happens around us. And as Torie pointed out, through formal agents that have authority over us, that make policies, that impact us as well. So we are exposed. It sounds terrible to say that these things are normal. I'd say that they are definitely part of our environment. So that said, let's look at how they show up in people. In the next slide, please. Thank you. So what you'll see when somebody has issues, experiences that have been overwhelming, that maybe in the short term their coping mechanism was to fight or flee, or to faint, or to freeze, some people would say. Over time, people develop coping mechanisms. And so what you'll see is people may have a strong aggression or a strong kind of shutdown in new situations or with new people. And so think about a transfer student, a person in a new school setting who gets into some a verbal conflict with someone who's maybe speaking loudly. Maybe that speaking loudly was part of that earlier overwhelm that got triggered. As an adult, I think of someone who might show up late to maybe a meeting or a presentation, and all of a sudden hijacks the group. It turns the discussion to whatever's on his mind or whatever's going on, like low impulse control. It relates to boundaries, to protect oneself, power struggles, and fear when someone's just enforcing a rule. So if someone asks someone to maybe step outside to finish the conversation, or to take food outside, or have a smoke, and the person may feel like attacked, right? Have a really strong reaction. And I'm thinking of adults, of maybe church folks, where people may have this strong objection to a new policy that is intended to, address an issue for everyone's good. Disengagement. So again, the strong attack or the strong pulling back. Interpretation of safety as predatory. I had a friend tell me about someone he knew who was in an accident. Someone was at fault, hit this person in a car accident. When the person saw the police show up, the person took off, went to the hospital emergency room on their own because they had that immediate fear that the law enforcement was not there to protect them, but could in fact do them harm. And there's minor events, this overreaction to something may be a sign that somebody's being triggered. I think of a student in class who had a history of sexual violence, and someone behind her was whispering something about her appearance. She felt immediately self-conscious. That triggered the incident previously that where she was sexually abused. She left the classroom, wasn't drawing attention to herself, went home and began cutting. And so that was a way for her to get back into her body because she had that strong reaction. We don't know what people are carrying and how they can be triggered. And these don't have to be kind of dramatic one-time events that we're talking about. These can often be what people have grown up with. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and I think what we're hoping to address with the next slide, Jaime, is now that we understand a little bit more about what trauma is and what trauma-informed perspectives teach us and how trauma shows up in youth, is what would be some actual tips then for addressing difficult issues with young people from a trauma-informed perspective.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned in the earlier introductory slides about empowerment and what was the other one? Collaboration, right? So those are part of this list here. Is what SAMHSA has identified as ways that we become helpful, empowering collaborators with people who are carrying trauma, that we don't do further harm, but we create a space and hold that space that those individuals can unpack and untangle, can learn from and transform their own past experiences. And so the bold ones here are kind of the original that came up, and the others have been added, also very, very important. But safety and trustworthiness are key. And so what does that mean for us? What does it mean for our mentee? How are we safe for them? How do they know that they can trust us? And it has to do with how we manage our boundaries, how we are clear in our role, how we use our authority, the spaces we use that are safe for them to have difficult conversations. And so these are core. If nothing else, if we focused on safety, it would be significant. And really think about, what does that look like? What does that sound like? How does that feel? And to the degree then that we have an understanding, appreciation of mentees' cultural background, the history that has impacted them, and gender issues, those are real significant, that we become more safe and trustworthy. And so the way that that plays out, I can talk about maybe a little bit more with some examples in a few minutes, but I think this is a starting point. And what Torie mentioned about creating that space, I would add to that, say, to hold that space, to be able to let someone else bring their story forward beyond what their immediate reactions is to what is at the root of their reaction. They have to have a safe space, and we have to be able to hold it. So I would echo that we have to know our own triggers. We have to know what our own ACE score is and how that has impacted us. There's no shame in having ACEs. Everybody does. The shame is not knowing how it's operated for us and how we have transformed it, and so how we can help others to transform their own. And finally, I'd just like to say, as part of understanding ourselves in the moment when a topic comes up, when a mentee comes to us and they're upset, or they're bringing a topic that may be difficult for them, it may also be difficult for us. And so I think of REI, like the outdoors outfitter, that the R, we check our own reactions and our own responses, that we're aware of that. So the more we have done our own work with our own, not just childhood, but as adults, experiences that have been maybe hurtful things that we've witnessed, maybe that have still had an impact on us, that we recognize that that's going on, and that even by recognizing it, that will help us to know how much we can explore with them, so we can acknowledge our own experiences perhaps, and let the mentee know that this is something that's really important, right? That you can engage with them. And as the others have indicated, the significance of listening, of not doing or problem solving immediately, but providing that emotional safety, providing that intellectual safety, so that you can then problem solve. And I'll say a little bit more later, but I think I should probably stop.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jaime. Excellent thoughts. And I'm always appreciative when we can get into the trauma-informed understandings, because it really gets at that. I find it really specific and really crossing the barrier between just sort of like behavior and emotions, but also like physiology. And so we can understand that our young people are reacting, if they've had trauma, as a physiological experience as much as it's a behavioral or emotional or interpersonal experience. And I think that's really important for our mentors' expectations and our staff expectations, and getting us out of the mode of changing behavior and into the mode of really meeting youth where they're at and helping them cope with the very real and serious traumas that they're dealing with. So thank you for that, Jaime. There was a quick question I noticed in the question box that can be addressed easily. Somebody was asking what ACE stands for. So it's adverse childhood experiences. So you might think of those as traumas, for example. Okay, so with that, I think we're going to jump into our deeper discussion. Thanks to both panelists for getting some initial thoughts out there. And folks, this is just a reminder, go ahead and be typing your questions in the question box. I do see lots of good questions already. We're going to start our panelists off with some questions that we came up with ahead of time that we think will get us deeper into the topic, but definitely going to get to some participant questions very soon. So first, I was hoping maybe that first Torie, and then maybe I had it the other way around, sorry. First Jaime and then Torie could maybe address. So what do you think are some of the more pressing issues that are facing youth today? And the second part to this question is, how might these differ across youth of different backgrounds? And I love that both of you bring such a cultural lens to what we're talking about, and we haven't delved as deeply into that yet. So I thought just putting a little meat on the bones here, what kinds of issues do we think we're most often talking about, and how might those differ across different populations? Jaime, you want to take a first stab? I think you might be muted, Jaime.
You're right. Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, there we are. No worries.
So, societally, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. Kids, youth, adults, we're all exposed to it. And that's in the mentoring world, we're helping people go from familiar and simple to unfamiliar and difficult. And so safety and trust, I would say, again, are some of the most pressing issues. Do people feel physically safe in their own skin? Do they know that they can trust authority? And so I think, again, that means that we have to be clear in our boundaries and provide safe and trustworthy boundaries. We have to hold on to our roles as mentors, as you were mentioning earlier, Dr. North, about confidentiality. I mean, we share some of our stories, but really we're not buddies. And so we are mindful of our authority. And when those things are in place, I think that will help to build safer and more trustworthy relationships for the youth.
Okay, thanks. How about you, Torie?
I would agree. Am I being heard? Okay.
Yep, we hear you.
Okay. I would definitely agree with what Dr. Romo says, and I would specify that that well-being is particularly concerning for certain populations of youth. So right now, I really worry about my Muslim youth. I really worry about my undocumented youth, and I really worry about my Black youth, because right now, and that's not to ignore other marginalized identities, but in terms of sort of media representation, in terms of actual statistics we've already seen about, different acts of violence that are happening against particular groups, I worry about how those young people are faring, even in addition to. So what's interesting is that when we're talking about young people, and I work specifically with high school youth, this is in addition to their developmental issues, right? That teenagers already have like sort of a sense of angst and, sort of this identity development and growth that's happening. So in addition to the natural sort of order of things, then they also have to worry about their identity being marginalized outside of them, and then fearing for their physical safety, how they're being treated in schools, how they're being treated on the street. So I think for me, those particular youth are the ones who are really facing some pressing issues.
Great, thank you, both of you. And let's sort of build on those questions with our next slide. Jennifer wants to ask a little bit more about these cultural issues and cultural differences. And this is a question that comes up a lot. Are all difficult issues cultural, or are only some issues cultural? Do we always have to consider the cultural side of things, or are certain things cultural and others not? And I know that's kind of framed in a crude kind of a way, but it seems like a jumping off point to get into more detail about this. So Torie, would you like to begin with that?
Yeah, so for me, from especially thinking about critical mentoring being heavily informed by critical race theory, one of the first tenets of critical race theory is that racism is normal. And so when folks say things like, well, does it have to be, necessarily about race? I know that there are, things that don't always have to have, an extreme sort of, well, that's about race. I get that there are nuances, et cetera, but we often forget that so much of what we do is informed by race without even thinking about it. We don't even recognize that it's there. It's almost it is a part of our subconscious at this point. So I think that, even if it's not something that we sort of jump to immediately, it needs to be something that we interrogate, and it needs to be something that we consider in terms of what's happening, but then also in terms of our response to it or lack of response to it. I mean, there are so many studies that highlight things like, teachers, for example, seeing students of color as being more aggressive than they actually are, or as being more adult than they actually are. Those are things that we can't take for granted. There's even been studies done on the fact that folks of color receive less pain management from hospitals because they're just perceived as either subhuman or as being stronger than other folks who may need additional support. So I think that we can't just ignore or dismiss how that sort of informs our everyday thinking. It needs to be at least considered.
Excellent thought. Thank you.
I would just agree and to maybe offer the flip side of that. I mean, well, of course, to say that culture is everywhere. I mean, that's a good thing, right? But some cultures are considered maybe different, meaning not the norm. And so some of the things that Dr. Weiston is pointing to is that what happens to people who are not seen as the norm. And the flip side of that is those who are seen as the norm then do experience a lot of different things differently. And so the idea of what someone said about white privilege, that sure, people have difficulties, everybody has difficulties, and white privilege doesn't mean that white people don't have difficult lives. It's just that their life isn't difficult because they're white, right? And so it's not neutral. That's what I'm saying. There's in everything we're bringing in our bias, we're bringing in our sense of privilege. If you think of that as, a person who, if you've been a biker, like riding a bike to go to work, or just to explore the city or whatever, and now the lanes are designated that bikes can take a whole lane. But if you're driving and get irritated behind one of those people who's taking their designated lane, that speaks to this idea of like, hey, this is my road, right? And the people on the other side who are in their lane, as they should be, who are, in danger because some people may not literally see them or want them there, kind of speaks to being on the other side of not the norm. So yeah, cultural issues are always going on, bias for some in a positive way, bias for some in a not so positive way.
Wonderful. All right. And Jaime, to continue with you, let's go back to the trauma question. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you think trauma might play out within the actual matches? What are some of the phenomena we might see? You did a great job explaining how trauma shows up in youth. So then when we imagine youth and mentors interacting, how do we see trauma playing out there? And what might be some strategies to address those dynamics?
Thanks. Well, one example I think of is, I mentioned, here's talking to a mentor recently, and someone was kind of in crisis. They were really upset. They wanted to talk, and the mentor had to remember. They could see that they were kind of in distress. They could see from their physical, pacing and clenched teeth and sweating, so that they were not in a place to actually sit down. And so one strategy that mentor was to say, let's slow down. Is this a good place? Are we around other people? We don't have other people listening to this conversation. So one is to recognize the boundaries of when is a good time and place to have that conversation. And then when they did have the conversation, it was a process, of letting that person get out whatever the trigger is, whatever, the upset. Because when a person is upset, their neocortex isn't really online, right? I had a brilliant 8-year-old tell me one time, when anger goes up, thinking goes down. And that's really true, scientifically true. So, allow the person to vent, name what is going on, affirm, that it's okay to feel, to recognize. Affirmation, acknowledgement is a huge part of a healthy response. And then offer basically the choices as what the person wants to do. Choice was one of those pillars for a trauma-informed approach. So we're not telling people, but once people are identifying their own choices, then we can offer support. So, boundaries, being safe, and then allowing the venting, facilitating that, naming what's going on, affirming their experience, identifying the choices they have, and supporting.
Wonderful. All right, and back to Torie once more. We talked about engaging youth to solve their own problems rather than necessarily trying to fix or change the youth. So do you have some ideas of strategies that mentors and staff could use to engage youth in solving solutions in their environment?
Yes. So, and thank you for that question. I think we talked really a lot about this at the Summer Institute in terms of civic engagement and sort of official tools or strategies that can be used. So one is the concept of youth participatory action research. So just engaging young people and actually in a research project in which they don't just research it, but they like act or collaborate, right, to solve that problem. So either when things sort of naturally occur, to turn that into a youth participatory action research, or to make that an aspect of your programming. And then also a lot of the research around youth-adult partnerships, which I think obviously goes hand in hand with youth participatory action research, just ensuring that there are sort of structures in place for young people and adults to work together on something. And then I think, again, outside of the research or more formal areas, just having conversations as we're talking about, and then also, again, building into your program some sort of civic engagement process, some kind of outing, some sort of field trip, et cetera, that young people along with their mentors can do that will actually sort of spark some of these discussions and then spark some ideas around what to do about these issues.
Lovely, great thoughts. So this is a great moment for us then to turn to some questions from our listeners and participants. So we've been counting on Cheryl, our trusty and brave moderator, out there fielding all your amazing questions. I'm seeing them myself, and there's so many that are good. So I'm hoping Cheryl's had a chance to kind of pick some that seem to be raised more than once or that cut across some issues. So where do you think we should start, Cheryl?
Yep, you're absolutely right. Some really great questions from the audience. One thing that's percolated up a bit is parents and guardians. You know, how do we engage parents and guardians of our mentees in these critical conversations? Sometimes parents and guardians don't come to us with as open mind as we would like to see. So how do we kind of navigate the parent-guardian influence with the kids and the mentors?
Excellent question. Would either of you like to take that, Torie or Jaime? I think either of you would be well positioned for that.
I can offer one example of working with a group setting up a mentoring program in a homeless program where they offered housing and kind of support for families over a 3-year period. And it was real critical to set up that connection with parents, you know, to have that be integral, right? So it's not just they're sending their kids off somewhere to meet with some people, but to get to build trust with the parents, you know, that be safe if the parents may not be clear on safety for them in their own experiences. And so to be trustworthy, to be clear about our roles could be, especially, I would say, with Latino families, knowing that, you know, the whole family is part of that relationship with the individual. So to honor that and to make an effort to be present and available, so the families then can say, you know, les encargo mi hijo, right? I'm turning my child over to you.
Great thought. All right, Cheryl, do you have another one for us?
We do. I'm thinking about mentors, and when we're training our mentors to do this exciting but sometimes difficult work with mentees, what are some tools or resources that we can share with mentors to, one, get engaged with their own ACEs, you know, to understand that they too have ACEs and that they have some baggage and some things, and to get them to be a little bit more self-reflective. And then two, getting them to understand that kids also have ACEs. Even though they're kids, these are young people, but they too have ACEs, and to be cognizant of those.
Excellent questions. Anybody got that one I want to jump in on? Jaime, it seems close to your topic as far as the ACEs, but Torie may have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I've done some trainings specifically around that. And we spent time with actually having the 10 questions from the ACE questionnaire, have people rate their own ACE score, have them pair and talk about what that means for them. It may, for some, be really the first time where they felt like it was meaningful, important to talk about that. Not that people are suffering still with them, but just to acknowledge them, how they grew. And then we did some real practical exercises with first just being present to another person, being still, and had some very structured listening activities where people had a chance to try something new and just be heard, you know. And so there's some real practical skill building that comes, I think, for adults as well, who probably, I mean, there's a lot of studies about helping people in the helping profession that we come with a high amount of ACEs, you know, because we want to help. We don't want people to suffer the way we did. And so, yeah, we've been real practical, very, very, like, check out your own experience, talk about it, be able to listen to someone else's experience. You know.
Great. Torie, any resources or ideas to add?
Actually, I was going to say I fully agree. I don't have much to add there.
Great. There's also a handout that we're giving everyone today. It's a 19-page packet on discussing difficult issues with youth. So there's some materials there that folks can look at as well. I don't know if it has actual activities in it, but it certainly has materials that you could make into activities. And I just wanted to also make the point that I think it's not just about training, but also supervision. So if we're trying to get mentors to be more reflective, it's about how we guide them into that reflection through our match support and our mentor supervision. So when they, so making sure you have good, solid check-ins regularly, you're not leaving matches out in a vacuum, you're asking what's going on, and then when you're finding out what's going on, you're asking mentors, what does that bring up for you, and how are you feeling about that, and are you noticing any reactions in yourself? So you're really kind of guiding them through that reflection process.
And also, Dr. North, I don't know if it's a good opportunity to talk about the 5 whys.
Sure, yeah, please.
Yeah. So Dr. Rod Watts was talking to us about the 5 whys, which is something we can use to address root causes. That's the purpose of it. And basically what it does is just have us engage in that, continuing to ask why, so that we get deeper and deeper into the root cause. And the idea for that is so that we're not necessarily sort of imposing ourselves on the conversation or our ideas, but just questioning and then sort of allowing the young person to identify the root cause by answering those why questions. So I think that's a good tool. And I've seen it actually in several different templates that, Dustianne, I don't know if we can make available for folks, but.
Would be great, yeah. We gave a couple of handouts with today, but if you want to send it over, Jennifer, I think there's a way to send people something after, yeah?
Yeah, we can send out an email with a link to the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series website, and we can post all of those links and resources there.
Great. Somebody was also asking where we can get the ACE, or how we can find the ACE scores and all that. So Jaime, maybe you can send a link to Jennifer afterwards. I think we have time for
I can.
1 or 2 more. Great. Okay. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Cheryl, you got one on the ready?
I do. One thing that came up, and this came up from a couple of the audience members, is schools. When you talk about schools being toxic, just the environment, how can we as mentoring practitioners, training our mentors, talking to our kids, having interaction with our kids, how can we help them navigate the school environment, which, to your point, sometimes can be really toxic?
Excellent question. Torie, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so I think, again, going back to the idea that we first have to be aware that that's happening, so we have our own ideas about schools and different experiences. As an educator, I realized that one of the things I've done well is school. And so I had trouble checking myself when I would tell youth, to just sort of put up with things, because I put up with them and I did that well. So I was expecting them to navigate in the same ways. So just being aware that schools are, sites of trauma for many kids. Secondly, having conversations about actual sources that they can identify within schools. So, there's, again, checking our own ideas, but then just being aware of what kinds of resources that you can make available to them, people to see. I know when young people come to me complaining about things that happen in schools, we talk about, very adult ways to sort of address it. So, okay, well, who's the person that you can, issue a formal complaint with? Have you talked to your parents? Can you engage them in advocating on your behalf in this particular situation? What are some ways that you can sort of process this negative conversation you've had with this educator, et cetera, et cetera? So I think it becomes a real opportunity for us to sort of acknowledge where they're coming from and the experiences they've had, and then giving them very real world opportunities to challenge those things that they're experiencing.
True, wonderful. Yeah, how about you, Jaime? Anything to add there?
Well, I think some of the principles that there's a program that's now national. It's been going since '80, called AVID, Achievement via Individual Determination. It's a very neutral sounding name, but it's very much about having spaces and people that, teachers and a team around students to say, yeah, we recognize that this is an unfair set of resources and dynamics here in this environment. And so we're going to work with you. We're going to acknowledge that it may not be fair, and we're going to support you as you process, as you navigate. So there's some built-in resources, and there are more and more schools that are taking up a trauma-informed approach. So I'm really hopeful with that.
Great. Wonderful. All right. I think we're coming to a close here, so I want to get to one last question that I know Jennifer had for us.
Yeah, thanks, Dustianne. Yeah, so before I was a program manager here at Mentor, I was a program coordinator at a school-based mentoring program, and there was something I really struggled with related to this topic. Sometimes our mentees would come to their mentors with really difficult situations that the mentor didn't seem comfortable or equipped to address, whether it was issues of family conflict, trauma, or other really sensitive topics. So I'm wondering, how should programs train mentors to recognize when the mentors need help and to bring in those external supports and resources? And what are some other resources mentors can turn to?
Yeah, great question. And luckily I have some materials on this. So going back to this range of difficult issues, I think that one of the things that's useful about thinking of issues in these three categories, and of course it's a continuum and nothing's perfect here, but I think one of the benefits of looking at it this way is that you can kind of break down in each case what is appropriate for mentors. So on this next slide, we have our yellow category, which is delicate topics. Yeah, go ahead, one more. So these are the yellows, these are the delicate topics, and so these are some examples of them. And like I said, these are not when there's no crisis or problem, but just a topic that's difficult to talk about. And in general, I would say that mentors should be trained to handle having these conversations on their own. You should be training them to feel comfortable getting into some of this difficult territory. But you do want them to rely on program staff to help. So if that situation comes up and they have a conversation, it's great to suggest that they check in with your program staff afterwards and say, wow, this kind of, more delicate conversation came up, here's how I handled it, and get some guidance and some further feedback, maybe document it in your case notes in case it turns into something more pressing. These are topics that can definitely affect the relationship strongly, so good to be careful with them, but definitely want our mentors to feel empowered and comfortable dealing with them. Now let's go to the opposite end of our chart here. This is the red. This is crises requiring intervention. So these are the really tough ones. Again, just noting that they're not always bad, but they definitely are immediate and intense, and they require prompt decision making. So these really generally require trained professionals. You should have some clinical support in your program, somebody who has clinical knowledge or background or knows how to deal with really traumatic and or threatening issues. And mentors should not be left alone to handle these on their own. So you want mentors to come to you right away. Now, they might be in a situation where they have to handle something on the spot, but you want them to engage your program staff as soon as possible. And as a program, you want to have resources and referrals and expertise at the ready to help deal with these. So think about issues that have come up in your program or that could come up and try to develop some action plans to make sure that you're ready if these crises come up. And then our third category, which is that more middle category, which I've said can actually be the hardest category because you find yourself wondering, is there an intervention here available? Is there something to be done? The mentors may have a really hard time accepting some of these realities and accepting the fact that there's nothing concrete right now that can be done about it. So, but they are important issues, and we don't want to downplay them and say that they're not of concern. So knowing that they may have significant implications for the youth, but are not necessarily conducive to an immediate intervention, they definitely need to be monitored as ongoing conditions that the young people are facing, and just really working with mentors around how to accept that they're there without judgment and not focus too heavily on behavior change, focus more on this is your reality and I'm sitting with you in your reality. One of the things I often say about mentoring is that the goal is not that 6 months later or a year later, the mentee says, wow, my life was really terrible, and then my mentor came along and everything's been great ever since. The goal is, wow, I've been through a lot in the last 6 months or a year, and my mentor has been with me every step of the way. So that's a way to think about those. So this, obviously, this could be much more detailed, but that's some thoughts. And the handout packet that I've given you gives some additional guidelines and detail on that. So hopefully, Jennifer, that addresses your question. And I wanted to close, as far as our main content here, just close with the thought that in Chinese, the symbol for crisis is the symbol for danger and the symbol for opportunity. So just always remembering that these difficult moments for youth can be turning points, and it can really all rest on whether there was an adult that was there and ready and comfortable and able to help contain their experience and be with them through that experience. So I hope that you all are able to play that role and help your mentors play that role with our youth. So that's our main content. Just wanted to mention, I think our handouts are on the next slide. Is that right, Jennifer? Yeah, so we've given you 2 handouts. One is the Dealing with Difficult Issues with Youth handout packet. It's thick. It's got a lot in it. It does have some stuff on self-disclosure and confidentiality also. I saw there was a question about self-disclosure. There's some nice stuff in there about that. And then Mentor put out last year a little brief on talking with young people in the wake of violence and trauma that I also found really powerful and useful. So the link to that is here. And I think that's what we have for you today. I want to thank Drs. Romo and Weiston for your excellent and wonderful insights. Thank you so much for being here. And Jennifer and all the folks at Mentor, thanks for hosting us.
Thanks, Dustianne. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you all.
And to close us,
yes.
to close us out, I just want to share a couple additional resources for you to check out. We encourage you to check out the OJJDP National Mentoring Resource Center website for no-cost mentoring resources to help you apply evidence-based mentoring practices into your program. And as a reminder, 1 week after the webinar, all attendees will receive an email with a link to the CMWS webpage where we'll post the recording, slides, and those additional resources. And don't forget, we want your feedback at the end of today's webinar. Please answer the short survey to help us make the series even better. And be sure to visit the CMWS page on the Mentor website for an archive of all past webinars and information about upcoming webinars. And then finally, just thank you to everyone for joining us today, and a huge thanks to our panelists. It was really great. And please join us next month on August 17th for a webinar on theories of change and logic models. All right, everyone. Thank you again. Have a great day.
Thanks. Take care.